In today's tutorial, we'll paint some beautiful loose watercolor tulips, perfect for the upcoming spring season. Tulips can be painted in so many different ways, but this video will be showing probably the easiest way to paint them, using a round brush and only a few strokes. I'm also including a section with some practice exercises so you can get the hang of the strokes and the different flower variations you can make before painting the bouquet. Let's get started. As always, all of the supplies I'm using in today's video are linked down below. Like I said at the beginning, before we start on the actual painting, I want us to practice a few different strokes and a few different variations you can do to change the look of your tulips so that your painting can be uniquely yours. And I'm just going to use a scrap piece of paper here since we're just practicing. So I'm going to take my size 8 round brush and we're just going to get comfortable using different strokes. So let's start out with the most basic one. I'm loading up some of this deep alizarin crimson, and I'm starting with the tip of my brush. You're going to apply some more pressure down so it gets nice and wide, and then you're going to round out the edge just like that. And that's going to be 1/2 of the tulip. And we'll do the same thing on the other side, starting with the tip of my brush and leaving just a little bit of white space in between. And then using that brush to round out the edge. So that's a super simple way. I'm not going to paint stems on all of these yet, just because we're practicing how to paint the actual top part of the tulip for now. But we'll get to that later. So that's one way. There's a lot of different variations on that technique that you can do. So let's say, for example, you want it to be thinner and more closed up, then I just wouldn't apply as much pressure down. So in that case, I would start with the tip of my brush again, gently press down, and do the same thing on the other side. So it's the same technique, but you're getting a little more of a thin tulip. You can also play around with wet on wet. So you can see I started out very light there, and then you can tap in some darker value on top. We're going very loose style with these flowers, so don't be afraid to get loose with your colors and let that paint bleed and bloom. And if you need to smooth out any of those lines, you can just re-wet it and blend it out. So that's one way you can do it. And you can also play around with shifting the weight of each side. So these are pretty even. The line is basically going down the center, but another way you can do it is by making one side bigger than the other. So I'm going to start with a big petal on the right side here. And I'll be doing the same thing, but making that one petal a lot wider. So really putting a lot of pressure on my brush and doing the same thing on the other side to make one big petal. And I'm going to fill in that white space because this is one single petal. So that's the first petal, and then you go back in. I'm going to use a slightly darker value, and I'm going to add just a tiny little petal. It's basically just the indication of a petal, using the tip of my brush and carefully painting that in on the outside. So you still have those two sections, but instead of the line going right down the middle, it's off to the side. So you're seeing kind of this full petal and then just the indication of the other one. And same thing here, while it's still wet, you can always tap in some darker value. And when I say value, that just means the lightness or the darkness of your color mixture. Darker value means more pigment and less water. Lighter value means it's a lot more watered down. And you can play around with how light or dark you want things to be. And you can also add highlights to your petals. So while these are still wet, if you want to add a nice highlight, you'll just rinse off your brush so you have clean, dry bristles. And then you use the lifting technique to lift some of that color off the page, and you get that very light spot. That's really beautiful. So you can already see there's so many different variations you can do, but the overall technique remains the same. So I'll show you one other way. I mean, there's lots of ways to paint tulips, but I'll show you one other way that I like to do it. So I'm loading up my brush, and this time we're going to leave a little bit of a space in between the two sections to add some petals that would be in the back. It's a little hard to explain, so I'll show you what that would look like. I'm holding my brush at a bit of an angle, and I'm going to create a similar petal here. I had a little bit of streakiness, so just adding a little more water. And just creating that first part of the petal. And then I'm going to do another one on the other side, but I'm going to leave kind of a V shape of white space there. So doing the same thing, applying some pressure down, leaving a little bit of white space, and just smoothing out that edge. And now you can see we have that space in the back, and I'm just going to go ahead and add some petals back there. But first I'm actually going to tap in some more color here just so we can get those beautiful blooming effects while it's still wet. And if you don't like the look of these loose blooms, then you definitely don't have to do it. I want you to feel free to make your own creative choices as you paint, but I'm just showing you all the different variations you can do before we get started on the actual composition. And then with that white space there, we can just add the indication of some more petals ruffled up in the back. So I'm switching to a size 5 brush so I have a little more control. And I don't have a specific technique or a certain number of strokes you need to add. I just kind of go in with a darker color because those petals would be in the shadows back there. I don't want to fill in the entire thing. I want to leave a little bit of white space. And you're just kind of letting the viewer know that there are petals back there, but you're not exactly seeing each individual one. So yeah, those are some of the most common ways that I like to do it. Again, it's all using pretty much the same technique, and you can be as detailed or as loose as you'd like to be. Like you said, if you want to keep it very simple, all you have to do is create basically 2 strokes. You apply some pressure down, round it out at the bottom, and do the same thing on the other side, leaving that little gap of white space. And that gap is really important to show that there are 2 different petals. Otherwise it would just be one blob of color. And then the other variation is just changing where that line is. So again, you can create a nice big petal, make sure the bottom is rounded out, and then just use the tip of your brush to create little side petals to show that there is more going on there, but you can't really see it. And again, to create dimension, if your petals are looking a little too saturated like that one, you just lift up some color with a clean brush, and it looks beautiful. So we have a good variety here, so now let's practice how we'll paint the stem. And the same thing with the stem, you can be as detailed or as loose as you like. If you'd like, you can just go ahead and paint some green down here at the bottom. I do a little bit of a U shape there, and then just create a stroke like that to make the stem. And you can see some color bleeding here because the tulip's not totally dry yet. So if you're okay with color bleeding, then you don't have to wait. But if you want it to be totally separated, you'll just want to make sure the flower is dry before you start painting the stem. So you can leave it like that if you'd like, or you can go back in and tap in some more shadows of green along the bottom and along the side. I like to do that and then just take a clean damp brush to kind of soften it out a little bit. And again, I really just want you to feel comfortable and confident in making your own creative choices as you paint. So if you don't like this blending on the stem, then you can just do one solid color and keep it loose. Or if you want to make it ultra realistic, you can do as many layers as you want and really build out that realism in the stem. But I just wanted to start with this exercise so that you can get a feel for all the different variations you can do to really make it your own. And one last thing I want to do is practice the tulip leaves. So leaves on the tulips are generally pretty thick and long, so I'm going to move up to my big size 8 brush again, and I'll start with the tip, apply a lot of pressure down, and then lift back up. You can see a little streakiness there because I don't have enough water and pigment in my brush, so just going over that again, applying pressure and lifting back up. And you can leave it as is, you can make it even thicker with more strokes, and just like the stem, you can go back in, add some wet on wet, watch that color bleed, and again, feel comfortable making your own creative decisions here. If you want it to be very loose, then I like to just drop in some color and let those colors bleed and bloom organically. Or if you want a little more control, you can start blending it out and adding more layers. So there you have it. You can keep it simple. You can do some tulips with petals in the back and just play around with your brush strokes. So hopefully you're feeling a little more confident in the techniques we'll be using, and now we can start painting the actual composition. Okay, so you can see I have some pencil marks here. That's mostly just to keep me centered on the page. Don't feel like you have to sketch anything out. Again, these techniques are pretty simple. I just wanted to kind of keep in mind where I want those main flowers to be, but don't feel like you have to sketch anything. And also feel free to, like I said, make your own creative choices. If you want to have some thinner tulips or you want to have thicker tulips, you want to use different colors, by all means, go for it. So I'm going to start on the left just because I'm right-handed, so I like starting on the left side of my paintings, and I'm going to paint a pretty simple one down here. And I'm going to really be utilizing that wet on wet technique, so I'm going to start nice and light so that I can build in some darker colors. And I'm making that first stroke, and I'm going to have that center line just a little bit off center. So that first petal is going to be a little bit thicker, and then I'll keep it nice and thin on the right side. And while it's still wet, I'm going in with a darker value and just tapping in some of that color and watching it bleed. I think it creates such a beautiful effect on these tulips, and a lot of tulips in real life have this type of design on the petals. I'll see if I can insert some reference photos here on the screen, but a lot of them have that kind of loose, bleeding, blooming effect between the colors. So that's just something I like to do. And you'll see me kind of going back and forth between adding some color and then lifting some of it up. Again, if you want to keep it simple, you definitely do not have to do that part. It's just something I like to do in my own style, just to make it a little more unique. All right, so I'm happy with how that first one looks. And then this tulip on the top, I think I'm going to do the practice techniques that we did where we had some petals in the back. I want this top flower to be the biggest one, and usually that technique works when you have a little more space to work with. So again, I'm going to start with an angled hold, make a nice big petal, applying plenty of pressure down. And I want to make sure I have enough room for that V shape up at the top. And always rounding out the bottom so you get a smooth base of the tulip. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm using a very watery mixture. I always like to start light because you can paint dark on top of light, but you can't do the opposite with watercolor. So I start light, and you can always add on more color if you need to. And making sure I leave a little bit of this open white space so that I can add those petals. I didn't leave myself a whole lot of room, but that's okay. And before I add those back petals, again, I'll do the same type of wet on wet technique here, dropping in some of this darker value of my crimson color. And this works a lot better with 100% cotton paper, so if you're using student grade paper, just be aware that it might be a little trickier to manage your water control and do blending like this. That's why I always recommend using 100% cotton paper if you're able to. It's definitely expensive, but if you want to do blending and lifting and layering, it's kind of a must. And I'm just going to lift some of that color up and just make some final adjustments here. And then that space in the back, again, I didn't leave myself a whole lot of room, but that's where I'm going to add the rest of the petals. And again, I just kind of wing it here. I use the very tip of my brush. I leave a little bit of white space so I'm not just turning it into a blob of color. And I'm just showing that there are more petals to this flower, but you can't necessarily see them all. And now we can do the last one. Or if you want to have more than 3 flowers, you can have more than 3 flowers. I just wanted to keep it nice and simple. So kind of similar to this first tulip, I'm going to do it angled the opposite way. So the bigger petal will be on the right side this time, and then adding the second one on the left. And I just have barely any white space there, but it's enough to show that there are 2 petals making up the tulip. Tapping in some more color up at the top and down at the bottom. Just really taking advantage of the surface while it's still wet to get those beautiful organic blooms. And I'll make this other petal a little bit darker. And it's looking good, but it's a little too saturated, so I'm just gonna rinse off some of that additional color and use the lifting technique to create a highlight. All right, so I'm happy with how those tulips look. I'm gonna let them dry for a bit so I don't get too much bleeding. And then we'll do the stem and the leaves. All right, so everything is nice and dry. Now we can get started on the stem and the leaves. And for this, I'm going to be using a little bit of my deep sap green, a little bit of hooker's green, and then I'm also mixing some of the pink that I was using into that green just to tone it down a little bit. And I'm using my size 5 brush. And starting with a light value. And I like to start by just outlining the base of that tulip with a light value. And I want to be even a little lighter than that, so I'm going to water down my mixture a bit more. And just use a light hand, tip of your brush, and just like we did in the practice session, I'm going to go back in while it's still wet and just deepen the tonal value on some of those areas and add a little bit of shadow to the stem. Just be careful when you do this part that you're actually painting within that first layer. You don't want to make the stem too thick. And then taking a clean damp brush to smooth it out. Once again, you don't have to do this layering part if you don't want to. You can keep it super simple and do one layer. Or if you want to make it more realistic, you can add as many layers as you like. I just kind of prefer to do kind of a mix of the two. I like to add a little dimension, but I'm not going crazy with details. And just darkening some of these final areas. All right. So there's our first little stem, and while we're already here on the left side, I'm going to go ahead and add one of our big leaves here as well. So again, to do that, I'm starting thin with my bigger brush, applying a lot of pressure down, and then lifting back up to get the point at the tip. And I want that to be even a little bit thicker and a little bit darker for my first layer, so I'm going to do a couple more strokes here, applying pressure and lifting up. And then just like we did with the stem, I'm going to go ahead and add some wet on wet. You can probably tell by now that I love utilizing the wet on wet technique. I'm sure if you joined any of my online classes, you have heard me rave about the wet on wet technique. It's one of my favorites, especially for loose style painting. It just creates these beautiful blooms that I absolutely love. All right, 1 down and 2 to go. So let's move on to the big flower here in the center. I'm going to do the same thing. So starting with a pretty light value of my green mixture, and I always start just by making a little U shape at the base of the tulip and then coming down. And I really like the look of these stems kind of intersecting and overlapping. So this one will be coming down behind this first stem that we painted. So just connecting it down there at the bottom. And then once again, while that first layer is still wet, I'm just gently tapping in some darker color to deepen some of those areas. So just gently adding in some color at the base. That's usually one of the darker spots. And then I blend it out just by rinsing off my brush and using the damp bristles to soften it out, because I don't want any harsh edges on my painting. And also be mindful while you're painting your stems to give them a little bit of movement. You can see this one's really curved here at the bottom. When you make a stick straight stem, it just doesn't look very realistic, and you want to make sure you just have a little bit of movement. So just gently adding some deep shadows here along the stem. And this is also a great time to practice your water control too, because I want that first layer to just have an even layer of moisture, so that you get a little bit of bleeding, but not too much to where that darker color just floods the entire stem. Because then you're just left with an all-around dark stem, and I want to maintain some of those lighter areas. So just going back and forth between adding some color and lifting some color. I think I'm also going to add a little leaf coming up the middle here. And you don't have to use a bigger brush if you don't want to, but usually the tulip leaves are nice and fat, so I just make it easier by using a big brush, applying some pressure down and lifting back up. And I want that to be even thicker, so I'm just carefully grazing that third tulip. And then I'll just go back and forth, adding a little more color and smoothing it out. And now we'll move on to the very last stem. And unlike gouache or acrylic, watercolor is always going to be light to dark if you plan to layer, because you just can't really add light watercolor on top of dark unless you're using the lifting technique to lift some pigment away. So that's why I always like to start lighter and then add more pigment as you go, because you can always add more color, but it's a lot harder to take away color. And again, I'm having that stem overlap, or actually it's underlapping because it's behind the other two. And it just gives the piece some nice dimension because you can see what's closest to you and what's a little bit further back. Utilizing the wet surface here to add a little bit of shadows, and making sure to keep the width of the stem nice and thin and dainty. So just being careful not to make it too thick, and anytime I add more layers, I'm keeping it within that original base layer. All right, and now onto the final leaf. I'm gonna have one coming up on the right side, kind of twisting out to the right. So using my bigger brush again, applying more pressure down, giving some movement to the leaf and lifting back up, and doing the same thing on the way back down. I love these Princeton Velvet Touch brushes because you can get those really wide strokes, but they also maintain their tip very well, so you can still get those nice details when you want to. And same as before, going in and dropping in some additional color and smoothing it out a bit. Alright, so there you have it. I hope you enjoyed learning how to paint these tulips. As we talked about, there are so many different variations you can make to change how in or out of bloom you want your tulips to look. And also the colors you choose can really change the overall painting as well. So if you want a bright spring bouquet, you can opt for those pastel colors. Or if you want more of a bold romantic vibe, you can find a color closer to mine, or something like a Paraline Maroon to go even darker. And again, all of the exact supplies I used today are linked down below. Thank you so much for joining the tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.